Not that long ago, in 2003, a devastating heat wave hit the European continent. As many as 70,000 people may have died as a consequence of that heat wave. And this happened in some of the most advanced countries in the world, with the best social services, emergency services, and health services. Just 7 years later, another devastating heat wave hit most of the northern hemisphere, killing as many as 56,000 people in western Russia, most by heat stroke, but also many due to the numerous wildfires that broke out during the heat wave. Two of Europe's worst heat waves in the last 5 centuries occurred within less than a decade of each other. Is that natural, or are we headed into a dangerous and unpredictable period for our global climate?
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend, the end of our love.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. I'm your host, David Appleson. Today we will look at two of the worst heat waves ever. Ironically, as we here in the Northwest U.S. endure a long cold snap. That these two record-shattering events happened so close in time to each other, and so recently, is another part of our discussion. The first heat wave, in 2003, struck Western Europe the hardest, particularly France. The second heat wave, in 2010, affected the whole northern hemisphere. However, it struck Russia the hardest. Moscow had one straight week of 90 Fahrenheit or 30 Celsius plus temperatures. Some estimates have the number of deaths caused by the 2003 event as high as 70,000. The 2010 event was responsible for 56,000 deaths in western Russia alone, and the summer heat records were a worldwide phenomenon. Heat waves are often referred to as silent killers because the victims are often elderly or very young, and most often they die at home, a supposed place of refuge, not out in the street. Had the thousands of Parisian and Muscovites killed by excessive heat were found all in one place instead of spread out individually, this would have been a horrific visual cataclysm seared into our collective conscience. Instead, many of these people died alone and out of public sight, just as they did in London in 1952, when a thick smog took the lives of thousands of people in that city. Is it a coincidence that two of the worst heat waves ever happened within 10 years of each other, and so recently? Is the Earth in fact heating up, getting ever hotter year by year, or did it just happen by chance? Are the actions of humanity having an effect on the weather, or is this just part of a natural cycle of cool and warm periods that have been going on for millennia, long before the arrival of man? In order to address the prevention or mitigation of such disasters in the future, we will need to understand if there is anything we have done to change the temperature of the planet, and if we have, is there anything we can do to reverse that change? There's a debate going on right now about whether man's actions, particularly deforestation, the burning of fossil fuels, and the production of chemicals, is causing the Earth's atmosphere to get ever hotter. It is far from a settled debate. A significant number of people, including many scientists, believe that our actions have no or little effect on the environment, and that it would be a serious and costly mistake to reduce or stop these actions. There's also a considerable number of people, including many scientists, who believe we are causing the planet to warm, and by doing so are endangering the lives of everyone. So let's start this discussion by going to the very root of this argument. How we arrived at the facts that determine if the planet is actually warming or not. Just what is the scientific method? More than 1,000 years ago, mathematician and critical thinker Al-Hazzan of Cairo wrote about the importance of forming questions and testing those questions. He's widely considered to be one of the earliest theoretical physicists. That is a proponent of the concept that a hypothesis must be proved by experiments based on confirmable procedures or mathematical evidence. The results can't just be a one-off. If the manner of testing the theory cannot be duplicated, or the results are far different when correctly duplicated, then it isn't science. The scientific method starts with a question, or a hypothesis, which is a speculative question. Let's start with one of my favorite scientific inquiries, which I learned about on the amazing television series by James Burke, Connections. Edward Muybridge's photographic experiment. Muybridge, a professional photographer, was commissioned by Leland Stanford, a 19th century industrialist, to help settle a bet. Does a galloping horse ever take all 4 feet off the ground at the same time? That was Muybridge's starting point. His hypothesis was based on the visual observation that it appears for the slightest fraction of a second that a galloping horse is airborne. His next step was to develop a testable prediction. Muybridge thought, hey, I can prove that all 4 feet leave the ground at once by taking a photograph of it, which he did. But the press did not accept this photographic evidence. Where's the context, they asked. We need to see the before and after. Maybe you just got the horse to jump in place. So in June 1878, Muybridge went to Stanford's farm in Palo Alto, California, and set up a series of 24 cameras spread an equal distance apart and tripped to go off when the horse crossed a wire in front of its path. Now Muybridge had a way to test his theory. He would record a galloping horse in 24 movements. A jockey by the name of Dom got a mare named Sally Gardner up to a gallop of 36 miles per hour and ran the course, tripping each of the wires rigged to the cameras. The result was a series of pictures which, if watched in rapid sequence, produced a moving image. That's right, Muybridge had discovered motion pictures, and he resolved the central question or hypothesis. All 4 legs of a horse do lift off the ground during a gallop. It's right there in frame 3. Muybridge completed the circle, from observation to hypothesis to testing to analysis to result, and the result, of course, prompts further questions. The Muybridge experiment was easily duplicated and produced similar results each time. And that is our scientific method, without which we wouldn't have prescription medication, automobile travel, the nuclear bomb, weather forecasting, kitchen appliances, or the device through which you are listening to this very podcast. Which brings us back to our central question. Is the Earth warming? And if it is, are humans responsible for that warming? Let's start with what is a heat wave. Different sources have different definitions, and heat is relative to the geographical location. A week of 103 Fahrenheit degrees plus days in Phoenix, Arizona, or Alice Springs, Australia, is just business as usual. But that same week of 103 degrees in Paris or Moscow is cause for alarm, because they only get temperatures like that every couple of 100 years, or at least they used to. Therefore, some sources measure heat waves based on the number of days above the average temperature. For our purposes, we will go with the definition that meteorologist A.T. Burroughs came up with in 1900. That is, a heat wave is 3 days or more of maximum temperatures of 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 Celsius as measured in the shade. Our core body temperature is normally 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Our systems struggle when our temperature rises to 102 degrees Fahrenheit, and we run a great risk if temperatures are sustained at or higher than 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius. It is right around that threshold that the average human body at rest starts to have difficulty coping with the heat, and the conditions are right for apartments without air conditioning to quickly turn into ovens. Scientists studying the weather found the year 2003 to be an unusual year. An anticyclone stationed above Western Europe prevented precipitation from falling and led to record-high temperatures over sustained periods. However, records show the global temperatures were on the rise in the years leading up to 2003. Lingering effects from the decaying El Niño event of 2002-2003, as well as an unusually active West African monsoon, were already creating a heated environment. During the European spring, mature El Niño events tend to create anomalies over the northern Atlantic that are associated with below normal rainfall over the western Mediterranean. Also, the West African monsoon reached further north that year and was more intense than usual. That led to a hotter and drier summer west of the Mediterranean region. According to Kevin Trenberth, director of the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Colorado, there are other possible causes for the heat wave. A change in global sea temperatures and unusual conditions in the tropics and the tropical area of the Indian Ocean was a factor in creating and sustaining settled air conditions over Europe, he says. In these conditions, air doesn't move around as much and winds do not pick up. Furthermore, stagnated air creates perfect conditions for air pollutants to emerge. That stagnant air, coupled with the unrelenting heat, say some scientists, was responsible for a large number of the deaths. Pollutants like smog, dust, car, and factory exhaust mixed with the stagnant air, creating a toxic potion for sensitive populations like young children, the elderly, and people with respiratory conditions. Add to that the fact that most buildings in the affected area are not air-conditioned, and the combination proved to be a recipe for disaster. Storm systems and weather patterns move in what are called jet streams. Sometimes these streams of air move straight, carrying storms across, and other times they move in curves, which can block storms. That summer, an omega block formed, named after its shape, which resembles the Greek letter omega. That blockage occurred when an area of high pressure was locked between two areas of low pressure on either side. Over Europe, this high allowed hot air from the Sahara to move north and essentially get trapped over Europe. Clear skies allowed for the temperatures to rise even further, creating a stronger dome of high pressure, reinforcing the already stagnant omega block pattern. The high pressure blocked any potential storm systems from moving over Europe, instead pushing them to the north like a large boulder diverting water in a stream. The 2003 heat wave began in early August and was notable for the progressive increase in the outdoor high temperature from 25 Celsius on August 3rd to 37 Celsius, or about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, on August 4th, and it remained at that high temperature for 9 straight days. Such an extended heat wave had not been observed in France since 1873, when the temperatures were first tracked. This trapped and prolonged heat caused the number of heat-related deaths to increase dramatically in an exponential fashion as never described before. In France alone, there were 300 fatalities by August 4th, 3,900 by August 8th, 10,600 by August 12th, and 14,800 fatalities by August 20th, when government officials declared the heat wave over. The excess deaths occurred often in hospitals, but almost as often in the home and maisons de retraite, or retirement homes. Epidemiologists who study the effect of illness and disease in large populations speculated that this rapid acceleration in fatalities was a consequence of the cumulative effect of the exceptional intensity and duration of the heat. Others have speculated that the elevation of the low temperature at night, which did not drop below 25 Celsius or 77 Fahrenheit, didn't allow people to recover from the severe heat stress experienced during the day. And finally, the extremely high level of ozone may have been contributory. So how does ozone affect us? According to the Environmental Protection Agency, ozone can cause the muscles in the airways to constrict, trapping air in the lungs and causing the bloodstream to be deoxygenated. This starts with wheezing and shortness of breath, then leads to coughing and a sore, scratchy throat, inflamed and damaged airways, aggravation of lung diseases such as asthma, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis, an increase in the frequency of asthma attacks, a susceptibility to infection of the lungs, and eventually to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which can be long-lasting or even fatal. The timing of the heat wave was also unlucky or ill-conceived, depending on your perspective. The temperature started climbing towards the end of July. Now, in addition to having a 35-hour work week, the French also get an average of 30 days of paid annual vacation time. and late July and August is the most popular time to use that paid vacation time. Which means if you are in a major French city or many other European cities during the peak vacation time, all services will be short-staffed. That includes police, fire protection, emergency responders, and medical staff. That fact would play an important part in this disaster, as there were not enough responders to care for the many people who are suffering from the heat. We should also consider that France rarely experiences extreme heat, so residents were not prepared for it when it came. Also, many government officials were also on holiday, so there was a paucity of information being sent out to residents regarding how to deal with extreme heat. On one day alone, the day that is now known as Black Monday, 3,000 Parisians died. That is a bigger Parisian death toll than during any point in World War II. The morgue soon filled up beyond capacity. At one point, the city had to take over a refrigerated warehouse on the outskirts of the city as a makeshift morgue. One of the major contributing factors to the high mortality rate was the number of apartments in Paris with zinc roofs. These metal roofs had no insulation inside to block the heat, and rather acted as conductors of heat, baking the residents inside. Consider that very few people in France have air conditioning and are not used to extreme heat, and you can easily see how people's homes were turning into human ovens. Often it was not a matter of the victim contacting emergency services during a moment of pain and duress, but concerned neighbors, building superintendents, social workers, and absent family members concerned about unreturned phone calls. People were suffering in their stifling apartments, and they didn't know what measures to take to counter the effects of heat stroke. According to the Mayo Clinic, heat stroke is a condition caused by your body overheating, usually as a result of prolonged exposure to or physical exertion in high temperatures. The most serious form of heat injury, heat stroke, can occur if your body temperature rises to 104 Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius or higher. Heat stroke requires emergency treatment. Untreated heat stroke can quickly damage your brain, heart, kidneys, and muscles. The damage worsens the longer treatment is delayed, increasing your risk of serious complications or death. Hyperthermia is a rise in the body's core temperature, and if proper measures aren't taken, it can lead to heat stroke. Other common symptoms include nausea, seizures, confusion, disorientation, and sometimes loss of consciousness or coma. During the crisis, family members of victims lashed out at the government. "It's scandalous. The government has done nothing," said Martine Flau, whose 70-year-old mother's body had to be brought to a morgue in Paris from their home 50 miles away because there was no space there. A law limiting France's work week to 35 hours left medical centers and retirement homes doubly short-staffed. One of the most outstanding analyses of the Parisian heat wave was conducted by Richard C. Keller, an associate professor in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in his book, Fatal Isolation. Keller examined 95 victims of the heat wave who had lived their lives in a way that predisposed them to isolation, either never marrying or going through a divorce or being widowed. As it turns out, although the data on global mortality reveals that elderly women suffered disproportionately, Keller's examination of Paris's forgotten people reveals a disaster that was especially hard on men who tended to be younger and in some cases suffered from problems with drug addiction or from disability. Poor housing played an especially important part in the demise of the forgotten. Many of them lived in pitifully tiny lodgings as small as 100 square feet or less than 10 square meters, located right below the roof, which, as mentioned, were often made of zinc. These so-called chambres du bon, or subdivided units, are usually on the top floor just below the roof line, where most houses have their attic. Like an attic, the chambres du bon trapped heat that made the rest of the building cooler in comparison. These tiny rooms would not exist if it wasn't for the remaking of the city under the direction of Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann in the middle of the 19th century. Haussmann's projects created enormous social dislocation. Building codes combined with economic imperatives to incentivize the developers into partitioning apartments in such a way that the top units were the densest while the bottom units were the most spacious. These small apartments were originally occupied by domestic servants and typically had only a single window, making cross-ventilation impossible. They also normally did not have baths or showers. Those were located at the end of the hall if you were lucky, where everyone on the same floor shared. That fact also meant it was more difficult to do the easiest thing to cool off, and that is taking a cold bath or shower. Some of the units had no access to running water, and perhaps most devastatingly for those who lived there in 2003, Osman topped his apartment buildings with zinc roofs because of their durability, lasting for as long as 100 years. These roofs give Paris much of its charm, but they also turned the apartments into ovens that baked residents to death. It was a market-based decision made 2 centuries earlier that pushed the already marginal, the elderly, the undocumented, the addicted, and the desperately poor into the invisible spaces of the chambre du bain. Keller explains some of the unexpected problems that the heat wave caused in France. In the southwest, the heat melted the rubber insulation surrounding the hanging wires on the high-speed rail network, cutting their electricity and stranding trains and their passengers overnight in stifling heat with no ventilation. The heat hit poultry farmers particularly hard. By August 8th, more than 1 million chickens had died from the excessive heat, presenting a public health disaster to those charged with disposing of them. By August 9th, many of Paris's city parks were closed because of an unprecedented phenomenon. Trees were shedding their limbs, and the unpredictability of falling branches posed a danger to residents seeking respite from the heat in the city's limited green spaces. Keller demonstrates that the heat wave in Paris affected some groups more than others, but it wasn't just a matter of geography or income. He explains there are strong social and environmental explanations for such differences in the mortality burden. Climatologists and epidemiologists have long attributed such differences to what they call the urban heat island effect, which links land use patterns with heat concentrations. A preponderance of reflective surfaces, vehicle exhaust, ozone concentrations, tall buildings' capacity to stifle breezes, large concentrations of heat-producing sources, and other factors peculiar to urban environments create important temperature differences across landscapes. Sometimes the difference is as much as 22 Fahrenheit or 12 degrees Celsius between the downtown regions and the surrounding rural areas. Data suggests that it was the large urban agglomerations in central France that bore the brunt of the mortality burden. These studies indicated that fully a third of excess mortality during the heat wave was concentrated in the Île-de-France, or the Greater Paris metropolitan area, which contains 1/5 of France's population. Paris itself, which represents about 3.5% of the French population, suffered more than 7% of the mortality burden during the heat wave. Keller relates Eric Kleinenberg's study of the Chicago heat wave of 1995. Kleinenberg studied 2 adjacent neighborhoods that shared a constant heat load but experienced dramatically different mortality rates. Kleinenberg's study indicated that despite the roughly similar socioeconomic status of the 2 neighborhoods, the one with the higher mortality rate was marked by higher rates of crime and social decline prior to the event, while the other fostered a higher degree of sociability among its residents. It was the fear of leaving one's home that heightened the risk in this case. Kleinenberg argued higher degrees of sociability encouraged at-risk populations in the safer neighborhoods to leave their sweltering apartments and to seek cooler locations to beat the heat. Most fascinating is Keller's comparison of the 2003 heat wave to a cholera epidemic that broke out more than 150 years earlier. He showed 2 maps displayed side by side. One map depicts mortality during the 1849 cholera epidemic. During that epidemic, some 20,000 Parisians died, despite extensive sanitation efforts implemented by public health officials in the aftermath of an 1832 epidemic. The second map depicts mortalities in the city 150 years later during the heatwave event. There are several interesting similarities between the maps. Both show a corresponding gradient of mortality. Deaths are thin on the ground in the northwest of the city, but are concentrated in the southeast of the city. Although separated by a century and a half, the density of mortality was almost exactly the same on both maps. High crime areas had greater mortality, and safe neighborhoods had lower mortality. Keller cites another study by the Institut des Veilles Sanitaires that examined some 250 victims and 250 survivors of the heatwave. The study carefully analyzed a range of environmental risk factors for death by heat stroke and dehydration. Principal among these were the characteristics of the victims' lodgings. Those who lived on the top floors of apartment buildings were 4 times more likely to die during the heat wave than their neighbors on lower floors. Those who lived in apartments with no bath or shower were 2.5 times more likely to die than their neighbors, and those who had little or no social interaction were 6 times more likely to die than their neighbors. These social risk factors were as high as or higher than serious medical ones, such as heart disease or high blood pressure. The critical factor was less that apartments were small or located at the top, but that the apartments were isolated and the residents had great difficulty getting up and down their 7-story walk-ups. Taking a look at these apartments provides critical insight into the challenges such dwellings posed for those who lived and died there. Their floors were lined with loose wires and leaky plumbing, exposed to weather through open skylights, and often teeming with pigeons and mice. For the young and able-bodied students who lived on the same hallways as Pedro S., these conditions were inconveniences. But for the elderly and disabled, a descent down a narrow spiral staircase is life-threatening. For Paulette M., the 80-year-old who lived on the top floor of her building, retrieving mail a story below her room meant navigating a steep, narrow staircase. Bathing meant carrying a heavy bucket from the common sink in her mouse-infested hallway. Her final years were an assault on her dignity and a constant threat to her life. Such conditions are not new. As a public health report from the early 1960s noted, the elderly increasingly found themselves relegated to such spaces as a function of their poverty. The reporter observed that nearly all of the old live in buildings without elevators. Worse, his survey showed that by some apparent irony, the occupants of the ground floor are proportionately more represented by the most able-bodied groups, and less by those whose physical activity is quite diminished. An intersection of debility and poverty meant that the progressive weakness of many of the old will contribute to relegating them bit by bit into lodgings that are the least prepared to receive them. In the 1980s and 1990s, many elderly Parisians complained in demographic surveys about using bathrooms on different floors of their buildings than where they resided, and how the difficulties of the staircase led to seclusion in their apartments. Keller concludes by detailing the lives and demises of the victims in his study. Roger R. was a 48-year-old alcoholic who found himself out on the street after a domestic dispute. A friend offered him a room beneath the roof of a 6-story walk-up. On August 10th, the day that his friend found Roger's body, the temperature exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The blazing sun on the cloudless day reflected from the zinc roofs that surrounded the courtyard and added overwhelmingly to the heat load inside the building's attic rooms. In the months before his death, Roger had complained for days about sleeplessness. His alcoholism and the heat dehydrated him to the point of death. Patricia P. was a 44-year-old who displayed symptoms of mental illness. She lived alone in a room on the top floor of a dingy hotel in the Rue Le Tort, located in the decaying section of the 18th arrondissement or district. The 18th is one of Paris's poorest arrondissements, according to 2008 census data, and the Rue Le Tort is one of its most marginalized districts. Gang activity is common at night, fed by the neighborhood's easy access from the crime-ridden districts of the Saint-Saint-Denis. In her room at the dingy residential hotel, she showed signs of hoarding, and her personal belongings indicated a religious fervor that bordered on fanaticism. She collected Bibles and other religious texts and scrawled religious verse repeatedly in her notebooks. Louise F. had aged in place like many of the other victims. Her impeccably maintained sixth-floor walk-up on the Rue Ambroise Thomas had been affordable when she moved in with her husband during her late 20s. Surviving him by many years, it was all that she could afford when she remained there in her late 80s, no longer able to climb the stairs. She was surrounded by health care. She shared her building with doctors' offices and a pharmacy. But economic deprivation kept her housed in a suffocating apartment under the roof, and increasing disability put the city and its resources out of her reach. According to the building's concierge, Louise lived her life in near-complete isolation. She was the type who never wanted to bother anyone. Aside from a social worker, she had no family or contacts. When on August 14th, the concierge knocked on the door, there was no answer. So she telephoned the firefighters. They arrived and found Louise's body. From its state of decomposition, they estimated that she had died several days earlier. Pedro S. was perhaps the most active of the group. He had moved to France as a refugee of the Spanish Civil War. At 79, he still attended Mass occasionally, and in 2003, he had attended a social event in his building's courtyard. But the other residents there said that he ate or drank nothing at the party and talked to almost no one before returning to his apartment upstairs. Since his wife's death a decade earlier, he had fewer contacts and spent more time sequestered in his seventh-floor rooms. He had family and a few acquaintances from church, but rarely any visitors. On August 12th, when vacationers returned home to their apartments, they reported a horrendous smell. First responders found Pedro's body at 10 p.m., and he became one of some 2,000 excess deaths recorded that day throughout France. That became a common pattern. Younger, more socially active neighbors returned from their holiday vacations to discover the discomforting odor of their secluded neighbors' decaying bodies. Each of these instances points to an intersection of poverty, disability, and the structural violence of an architecture that struck hard at some of Paris's least resilient citizens during the disaster. The summer heat wave of 2003 wasn't just confined to Paris. More than 14,800 people died just in France. More than 6,000 people died in Spain, which recorded higher temperatures than France. In Amarluja, Portugal, a high of 118 degrees Fahrenheit or 48 Celsius was recorded. 2,000 people died in Portugal. More than 7,000 people died in Germany, 3,000 in Italy, and 2,000 in the UK. The heat wave caused glaciers to crumble and slide in the Swiss Alps. Crops shriveled, producing one of the worst harvests in years on the continent. And rivers dried up, leading to the shutdown of hydroelectric plants and nuclear plants which needed to pump their wastewater somewhere. Blackouts and brownouts compounded the problem for people trying to find escape from the severe heat. There was a great deal of blame to go around in Paris and in France. Government ministers were sacked and the cabinet reshuffled. Health officials were caught unprepared during the traditional August holiday period, and many Parisians did not find out about their neighbors until days after their deaths. But even today, a great number of Parisians continue to live in 6- and 7-story walk-ups with little running water, no cross ventilation, and zinc roofs. Just like the 2003 heat wave in Western Europe, the 2010 heat wave in Eastern Europe and Asia was caused by an omega blocking system, or persistent area of high pressure that blocks out the rain and traps the heat. It had already been an early and hot summer in Russia that year when the blocking system moved in. That caused the soil to dry out, which also contributes to drier, hotter weather. All of this happened while Pakistan to the south was experiencing record floods. And that is usually how global weather patterns work. As in France, it was the hottest summer on record going back to 1871 when the records were first kept. But an examination of tree rings and ice core samples suggest it may have been the hottest summer in more than 500 years. As to whether human-caused global warming contributed to this fierce heat wave is a point hotly contested by scientists. Although most of the scientific community agrees, we will see more events like this in the near future. Eric Fisher, a postdoc at the Institute for Atmospheric and Climate Science at ETH Zurich, said, "You can't attribute isolated events like the heat waves of 2003 or 2010 to climate change. That said, it's remarkable that these 2 record summers and 3 more very hot ones all happened in the last decade. The clustering of record heat waves within a single decade does make you stop and think." The heat wave began on June 12, when the average temperature for European Russia hit 35 Celsius or 95 Fahrenheit. That is 5 Celsius or 11 Fahrenheit above average. In Yashkul, the highest temperature would be recorded in European Russia on July 11th, when the mercury would hit 44 Celsius or 111 Fahrenheit. In June, a weather station just north of the Kazakhstan border recorded a temperature of 53 degrees Celsius or 128 degrees Fahrenheit. Let me remind you, this is in Russia, a land known more for its frosty winters than blistering summers. By June 27th, the heat wave had come to Moscow, an enormous city of more than 11 million people. Temperatures that day reached 33 Celsius or 93 Fahrenheit and stayed above 30 for the rest of the week. Sales of kvass, a drink made from fermented rye bread, boomed. By the end of June, more than 1,200 people had died in drowning incidents, often from mixing alcohol consumption with water sports or just by swimming in dangerous areas. The record heat brought record numbers of people to the beaches. By mid-July, 19 of Russia's 83 regions declared a state of emergency due to crop failures caused by the heat-induced drought. Electricity demand went up by as much as 6% in some oblasts or provinces, leading to power supply problems. Just as in France, this meant more people were finding it difficult to charge their fans and air conditioning units. By this time, temperatures in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kaliningrad, formerly Königsberg in the Baltic, were spiking at 40 degrees Celsius or 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Vadim Seryogin from the Russian Emergency Ministry said that 9 million hectares or 37,000 square miles of farmland were destroyed along with 20% of the grain harvest. Later in the year, the Russian government would move to block exports of grain, which had great consequences for the many nations that depended on those grain imports. It has been suggested that this might have been a contributing cause to the discontent that led to the Arab Spring uprisings that happened the next year. Moscow was reporting 700 deaths a day, which was twice the normal rate for that time of year, the difference being attributed mostly to the heat wave. Moscow health chief Andrei Selvatsky blamed weeks of unprecedented heat and suffocating smog for the rise in mortality compared to the same time last year. He said city morgues were nearly overflowing, filled with 1,300 bodies, close to their capacity. The Reuters news agency also reported that doctors were hesitant to diagnose weather-related illnesses, fearful that government officials might seek their dismissal. A doctor at one major hospital told Reuters that senior management issued instructions not to link illnesses with the heat wave. In late July, the first peat fires were reported. Peat is naturally occurring decaying vegetation, often found near bogs, moors, or swamps. Rich in carbon, peat can take centuries to build up to depths of 2 to 3 meters, or about 10 feet. Many of the swamps and bogs surrounding Moscow had been drained in the 1960s to make way for agricultural land, and the peat was mined to generate energy. In 2002, a series of hard-to-extinguish peat fires led the Russian government to recognize that the peat fields needed to be re-watered to prevent wildfires. By 2010, however, large expanses of peat had not been re-watered and were kindling wildfires. When the underground peat is exposed to air, as will happen after being drained or during times of drought, the energy-rich peat can catch fire from nearby wildfires or from spontaneous combustion. Natural cracks in the earth will feed these fires more oxygen. These fires can go undetected for days or weeks, eventually causing the ground above to collapse, at which point the fires move above ground, contributing to more wildfires that ignite more peat. On July 31st, the head of Americom, the Russian Ministry of Emergency Management, Sergei Shoigu, reported that the fire situation in the 17 federal subjects of Russia, especially in Vladimir and Moscow oblasts, may be complicated. He claimed that in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, the velocity of fires was 100 meters per minute, and the fiery airflow tore trees from the roots like a hurricane. By August 2nd, 7,000 individual fires had been reported, and more than 34 deaths were reported due to the fires. Moscow was covered in a haze of smoke that greatly reduced visibility. By August 4th, the fires had reached the outskirts of Sarov, the site of secret nuclear research in the post-war years where the Russian nuclear bomb was developed. Russian government officials stated there was no chance of a nuclear explosion due to the wildfires. That day, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev announced on television that practically everything is burning. The weather is anomalously hot. What's happening with the planet's climate right now needs to be a wake-up call to all of us, meaning all heads of state, all heads of social organizations, in order to take a more energetic approach to countering the global changes to the climate. We don't know if Medvedev's statements were cleared by Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, but 6 years later we can see how seriously that call to action was taken by world leaders. Environmental groups such as the WWF and non-systemic opposition politicians suggested firefighting had been slowed down by the Forest Code law passed by the Duma in 2006 at the order of Prime Minister Putin. That legislation transferred responsibility for the country's vast woodlands to regional authorities, putting 70,000 forestry guards out of work. Medvedev transferred blame to high-ranking military officials and scores were sacked. The firefighting infrastructure had also been scandalously neglected. There are only 22,000 professional firefighters in the whole of Russia, compared to more than 27,000 in Germany, which is a much smaller country. In addition, Russia's firefighting vehicles and equipment are often outmoded. Many people in Russia's provinces had to defend their villages and homes against the flames on their own, at times with little more than their bare hands. By August 5th, carbon monoxide pollution in Moscow was 4 times above normal. The wind had been merciful during the previous night. By that morning, the thick, acrid smoke over the center of the Russian capital had cleared, just a little. "Look, you can even see the sky," said newspaper vendor Natasha Ivanova. The previous day, at that time, she couldn't see further than 100 meters beyond her kiosk in front of the Pavlitskaya metro station. The city's high-rises remained cloaked in a wall of smog, and hot gusts of wind blew down the streets. Knowing that at any moment another cloud of burning smoke could descend upon Moscow, Natasha wore one of the protective face masks that Muscovites could purchase at local supermarkets. The face masks were intended for use by construction workers. The smog even seeped into the metro stations deep underground. The mass circulation newspaper, Pravda, described apocalyptic scenes reminiscent of horror movies. All of these pollutants were swept into Moscow on August 4th. Unofficial reports cited visibilities as low as 70 feet in some areas, approaching the so-called threshold of zero visibility. Elena Lezina, an official air quality spokesperson, reported air pollution surged 4 to 10 times above maximum safe levels. That is a new high. By August 8th, the smoke had failed to clear out, and news wires indicated that Moscow went into a near shutdown, with streets and cafes empty and schools canceling classes. Those who remained in the city were being urged to wear face masks if they ventured outdoors, and to hang wet towels indoors to attract dust and cool the airflow. Few apartments in the city had air conditioning, and there were media reports of wealthier citizens moving out of their homes into hotels, shopping malls, offices, and private cars. On the Russian blogosphere, one of the country's last outposts of unfettered expression, the mood was bleak and angry that the situation had become so serious. One blogger on the popular LiveJournal site suggested that Putin, Moscow's mayor, and other top officials be fired for not stopping the fires. Another LiveJournal blogger said the polluting haze had prompted her to quit smoking. Others focused on immediate issues like getting a good night's sleep. Every night it's like we prepare for war, blogger Sertsis wrote on the independent newspaper Novaya Gazeta's website. With open windows, it's impossible to breathe because of the burning, and with closed windows, we choke in the stifling heat. The health authorities urged Muscovites to stay at home and wash out burning eyes with chamomile tea. Russia's chief medical officer, Gennady Onashenko, advised employers to let their employees stay away from work whenever possible. But it seems that his advice was mostly ignored. The newspaper vendor Natasha had set up her stall in the middle of the thick smog. She had no choice. If she didn't work, she wouldn't be able to pay her rent. She had read warnings that within a few hours one can inhale as many toxins as those contained in 40 cigarettes. That is terrible, she said, but there's no getting away from it. That day, 7 Russian regions declared a state of emergency, and over 200,000 people were busy battling the fires, most of them volunteers alongside a few thousand firefighters and 10,000 soldiers. They used heavy equipment to cut huge troughs into the ground in an attempt to stop the creeping fire. According to the data received from NASA satellites, the smoke from the fires in some places rose to a height of about 12 kilometers and ended up in the stratosphere, which usually only occurs during volcanic eruptions. Satellite imagery showed that a cloud of smoke, 1,850 miles or 3,000 kilometers wide, covered western Russia. Environmental scientists stated that the brown cloud produced by the fires caused soot to land on Arctic sea ice, leading to faster melting. The release of industrial toxin from the fires could also contribute to the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. On August 12th, the winds finally shifted, and the skies partially cleared over Moscow, prompting many residents to ditch their face masks. The next day, Moscow was drenched by heavy downpours, bringing clear skies and cooler temperatures. Citizens were overjoyed at the relief. However, even with the rain in Moscow, new fires broke out elsewhere, including around the area of Sarov. Radioactive materials had been removed from the site when the fires first broke out, but these were later returned when it was thought that the danger had moved on. On September 2nd, a new wave of wildfires flared up before the summer heat finally abated. There have been no reports since of the radioactive materials at Sarov being threatened. The heat wave of 2010 lasted for 44 days, with afternoon highs consistently in the upper 80s to low 100s. The average high in Moscow during that same time period is 75 degrees Fahrenheit, or 24 Celsius. It was the longest heat wave on record and led to severe drought and wildfires. In Moscow alone, there were close to 11,000 excess deaths from non-accidental causes during this period, mainly among those older than 65 years. Most of those deaths were attributed to cardiovascular, respiratory, urinary tract, and nervous system diseases. According to an article that appeared in the journal Epidemiology, as many as 2,000 of those deaths could be directly attributed to complications caused by the wildfires. The German insurance company, Munich Re, estimated the number of deaths in western Russia due to the heat wave to be as high as 56,000. Heat waves were a global weather phenomenon that year. It was caused by a La Niña event that meteorologists describe as one of the strongest ever observed. The heat wave didn't just hit Russia, it also impacted Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, North Africa, most of Europe, Canada, and the United States. Worldwide, it caused about $500 billion in damage and may have contributed to the deaths of 18 million people through famine and heat stroke. That year also saw one of the largest glaciers in 48 years detach from the Arctic ice shelf. With all of the massive amounts of data we've been able to collect about the 2010 heat wave since that time, there's still no consensus among the scientific community that the heat wave was human-caused. It may have been global warming, or it may have just been a natural cycle in the world climate. There have always been heat waves and cold snaps, and there always will be. Yet, how did it happen that two of Europe's worst heat waves since the 16th century happened less than 10 years apart? Is that normal weather, or are humans having an effect on the global climate? That question brings us back to the topic of the scientific method. We depend on science to answer this question for us because there is no chapter or verse in the Bible that deals with global climate change. A significant number of people and a significant number of scientists refute the idea of global warming caused by human actions. For every heat wave, there's a blizzard, they argue. For every drought, there is a flood. It's all part of the natural cycle. If we curb pollution too much or regulate the extraction industries too harshly, we will do considerable damage to the world economy, costing people millions of jobs and ultimately leading to millions of deaths. There's no easy answer, and there has been no scientific study that has settled the issue beyond a doubt. France can address their chambre de bonne problem, and the Russians can reduce their number of dried-up peat bogs, but no one knows where the next heat wave will strike, and if that nation will be prepared for it. What we can deduce from this disaster, and others that we have studied, is that it is generally the wealthiest members who have the resources to get the most protection, while the poorest members are the most vulnerable. With an incentive like that, it may take a climate-related disaster worse than what we've seen in 2003 or 2010 to prompt the right people to take action. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. I would like to remind listeners that I'm an active member of Dark Myths, a collective of podcasters dedicated to exploring the dark side of life. Other podcasts in Dark Myths include Satan Through the Ages, Iroquois History and Legends, the Lone Gunman Podcast, Africa, a History, the Nighttime Podcasts, Pete's Paranormal Chronicles, the Eastern Border, and the Rumor Files. You can check us out at www.darkmyths.org. Thank you for hanging in there. I apologize, but life events keep getting in the way. However, you can congratulate me on being the new owner of a condominium, and the Podcast of Doom now has a new headquarters. May I never have to pick up and move again. Next week, we will examine the Bar Kokhba revolt, which occurred in Judea in the 2nd century. It was an important event in both Jewish and Roman history. Find out what was happening in the Holy Land in the century that followed the death of Jesus. I would like to wish you all happy holidays and that you have a fantastic, pleasant, and safe holiday period, and that you get to spend time with your loved ones. I will join you again next time. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.